So, Markus, thank you very much for coming, and it's very exciting to hear
Pleasure.
about this topic. This is really definitely the topic that we are all wanting to learn from. So, really, really interesting to hear your experience in Switzerland, and so it's all yours. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. Dear colleagues, let me share with you a project which I'm realizing together with Lukas Schönenberger, who is a young expert in healthcare from the University of Applied Sciences in Bern. We have studied the efforts of coping with COVID-19 in the Confederation, Switzerland. More precisely, we have examined the organization and management of the crisis at different recursive levels. The work is about diagnosis and design. The program for my presentation, I will present the case, I will talk about the methods, and especially about the system in focus, which is a federation. And then we go into diagnosis and design to end with a reflection. We are close to finishing our study, which started in March 2020. Our motivation for the research, first of all, there is a need to understand the organizational dynamics to learn from this pandemic. The ways of coping with them need to be improved. Second, the crisis was mostly addressed in epidemiological, virological, medical terms, while organizational concerns were hardly studied in depth. So there was a need for reflection. The third reason was that Switzerland is the ideal type of a federation and democracy, which raises special issues in an organizational analysis. In this country, a sophisticated structure has been put in place to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. Our research questions, can you see the top line?
Yes.
Can you see the top?
Research questions.
Oh,
Yes.
good.
Not,
Okay. Okay, fine.
are you sharing your screen?
Yes.
All right.
I'm sharing my screen. How is the management of the corona crisis organized in Switzerland? Second, how effective is this organization in coping with the dynamics of emergency? And finally, what lessons can be learned for crisis management in the future? To this end, we use the VSM as a conceptual framework. We are dealing with a federation, an organized body that has a number of features of viability and development. Now, is the VSM the best instrument to tackle these questions? Well, if the goal is to maintain the viability of the system in focus, in our case, the society of a country, then the VSM is indicated as the adequate conceptual tool, or better, model. So we are dealing with a problem. We are dealing with a problem in search of a model, not a model in search of a problem. The purpose of our study, to diagnose the status quo and make suggestions for the design of organizational improvements. The core of the study was carried out for 1 year until March of this year. So starting in March last year. Now I come to the case study, the corona crisis in Switzerland. You will remember 11th March last year, the WHO, the World Health Organization, classified the COVID-19 coronavirus disease outbreak as a pandemic. As most other countries, Switzerland was attacked massively by the virus. By the virus. Here is an overview of the development of the pandemic with the most salient events. In Switzerland, the first infection occurred on 25th February and the first corona-related 8 days later last year. Subsequently, as you see in the graph, both infections and deaths increased exponentially. The pandemic proved to be a threat due to the relentless rapid advance of the virus. Now the government, which is a federal council of 7 with a consensual mode of decision, took on the overall responsibility for a nationwide COVID crisis management. On the basis of emergency law, a drastic shutdown was imposed immediately mid-March for 3 months. So we have the Minister of Health here trying to control the virus. Then the Minister of Defense requested support from the army. This resulted in the largest deployment since the Second World War. Within 48 hours, 8,000 militia soldiers were available. In this country, the army is also responsible for civil protection. They performed multiple tasks, mainly logistics, transport, and medical care. During the shutdown, the population abided by the regulations, so the infections went down. Then in summer, infections were low and people became sloppier. The discipline turned worse. A second wave built up, which was way bigger than the first one. Measures were tightened, but the oscillations continued. In January this year, the second shutdown was realized until May. Vaccinations early in the year took off only sluggishly. Each canton had its own vaccination strategy. Some had vaccination centers, others, such as St. Gallen, a rollout via general practitioners. Only once enough vaccines were available, the best practice found was adopted widely. That is, in our case, a combination of vaccination centers and medical doctors. Eventually, the vaccination program gained momentum and they appear to be effective in combating the virus. Much of the events and many aspects of policy have been similar in Switzerland to other European countries. However, in many ways, Switzerland has pursued its own path of crisis management. Let me explain. First, the sovereign is the highest authority in Swiss political life. Hence, the cooperation relied on citizens' self-control as far as compliance with the rules and regulations was concerned. For example, wearing protective masks was almost entirely optional in the first phase. In the same vein, it was strongly recommended but not forbidden to avoid contacts between the generations. Second, the government in Switzerland is not a premier assisted by multiple ministers. Switzerland has a government constituted by 7 members of the Federal Council, called, as I wrote here in green, the Bundesrat. All decisions are made by that body consensually. The function of president rotates among them every year. In addition, there's a system of checks and balances involving the next level, the 26 member states called cantons, which have precedence over the federation. All of this turns political processes complicated, complex, and cumbersome. Government is slow, but I would add effective. Third, the rule of law defines 2 types of situations for which special powers are granted to the government. The first is the special situation, case of epidemiological urgency. It exists if the ordinary law enforcement organs are not able to prevent and control the spread of the virus. For example, H1N1 or the SARS epidemic, and so on. The stronger version is the extraordinary situation, that is a national threat situation. So should further measures be necessary in the event of an extraordinary threat to the public health, the Federal Council may order such measures on the basis of the Epidemics Act and issue emergency decrees without a basis in the federal law. Examples: Spanish flu 1918 and COVID-19 in 2020. Also the wars fall into that category. The Federal Council was bestowed with special competencies for these situations. For example, from March to June 2000, the national situation was defined as extraordinary, and the Federal Council ruled by emergency law, determining the first shutdown. Fourth, conceptually, we are keeping the terms lockdown and shutdown apart. Both designate a period during which almost all economic and social activities are shut down by political order, e.g. to protect against infection. However, the regime of a shutdown is less severe than the lockdown mode. Switzerland never had a full lockdown, even though the term was used, but there were no curfews that were imposed, no regulations, or the regulations were mostly limited to recommendations. For example, the borders of the country remained open with minimal restrictions, only random testing at the borders. There's no mandatory vaccination until now and no discrimination for non-vaccinated, which is also a big discussion. Discrimination, non-discrimination, and so on. Fifth, the regulations decreed in these situations were harsh, but they were less severe than in most other countries. For example, in January this year, a full breaking was carried out. The second shutdown, because B117 expanded dramatically, and it was virtually impossible to forecast the threat. Nonetheless, sports outside, including skiing and takeaway at ski runs, went on in most resorts. In comparison, all other alpine countries kept all their ski areas closed. So these activities could only be sustained because the resorts rigorously complied with all protective measures. Creative interpretations of the law also occurred. For example, the ban on using tables and chairs in front of takeaways on the slopes. That's a very delicate thing because people get infected easily and so on. Now, in Lacs, in Grison, a special solution was produced. Overnight, they built a snow arena where you could sit on the steps and have your meal on your knees. This worked and the protective measures were obeyed. And I could tell you other cases. Astonishingly, the discipline of both the cable car and lift enterprises, as well as the users, were exemplary. Over the holidays, Christmas, New Year, the infections, here it is, the infections went down and not up. The authorities had recommended to celebrate Christmas outdoors where infections are very unlikely. Christmas in the woods. Now, recently things have improved. The vaccination campaign has entailed a paradigm shift also in other countries. Fatalities have gone down radically and the new infections have receded. Just a word about the methods we use. Our main instrument for both diagnosis and design, as I said, VSM, Stafford never claimed that the model is more than a diagnostic instrument. Yet, as he himself and we, his students, have tried out many times. The model also works perfectly in the design mode. As far as the data are concerned, the material of the daily press was an abundant source we had to rely on. Also, other media, radio and television were important. For example, the media conferences about the crisis situation held twice a week with continuing involvement of the Bundesrat, the government. Finally, we led partially structured interview with key managers and politicians at 3 levels: federation, canton, and community. Let's go to the system in focus. First, we had to clarify the pandemic threatened the viability of our society. Hence, the focus of our study is on that society as it organizes itself to cope with the dynamics of the virus. Before we get into the structure, let us take a look on the identity of Switzerland. It is a democracy and it is a federation. I have to expand a little on that topic. Federation is the form of state. A federation is a political entity characterized by a union of partially self-governing provinces, states, or regions under a central federal government. The self-governing status of the component states, as well as the division of power between them and the central government, may not be altered by a unilateral decision of either party, the states or the federal policy or political body. On the other hand, democracy. Democracy is a form of rule or a form of governance. Coming from the Greek demos and kratein, the rule of the people. The sovereign makes the final decision on substantive issues. As the holder of supreme power, here they are. Obviously, the response time of a democracy versus an autocracy or a monarchy differ. In principle, an autocrat can react directly and very fast. If he will, is a different matter. A democracy can only respond that swiftly if it creates legal conditions that enable a management body to rapid response by eliminating certain decision paths and curtailing participation. The executive government at the federal, cantonal, and local level is vested in a committee rather than a president, and that committee must be elected. It rules by consensus, as I said, not by majority. On the left, you see the executive here, the government, consists of 7 members coming from currently 4 different political parties. The country has 4 official languages. In parliament, everyone can speak up in his or her mother tongue, and all laws are available in 4 languages. All of that complicates matters and takes more time, but it provides a powerful network. Some would call it machinery of complexity absorption, and it enhances both the quality and the acceptance of the decisions. I don't know, I have all these pictures of you on the side, but do you see the full screen? You see the full screen, that's important. Yeah. Okay. Structurally, we are interested in the federation as a whole. We looked at the recursive levels of federation, national state, the canton, and community. The criterion of viability is applicable to units at each one of these layers. And the management of a crisis like the pandemic must not be confined to 1 or 2 levels. For example, to top or to bottom, as often occurs. Complex issues surface at each one of these levels. They must be coped with in a layer-appropriate way along the fronts where the complexity emerges. In our study, we had to concentrate on the national level, but we also have the other two levels on the screen and reported on them, but I cannot treat this in this short talk. So the detailed diagnosis at the federal level is our topic. Originally, the cantons hold the power in the country. They are autonomous. The federal state can only interfere in their domain if the law enables him to do so. Paradoxically, it is the cantons that delegate tasks to the federation, tasks that they cannot handle on their own. That is the principle of subsidiarity, which runs counter to common practice, delegation from above. Instead of top-down, subsidiarity is delegation bottom-up. And that is a rather cybernetic arrangement. Direct election is a practice in the municipalities and cantons. Depending on the canton, this occurs at the urn, but also the custom of election. Here are I didn't show this yet. These are the 26 cantons of Switzerland. You see here Bern, the capital, you see Zurich, and you see St. Gallen here, where I'm located. And I would like to call your attention to the show of hands approach. For example, in Appenzell, the famous county assembly called Landsgemeinde takes place every year on the last Sunday of April. Appenzell Innerrhoden is one of the last cantons to retain this original form of democracy. The Landsgemeinde is a 600-year-old tradition in which the cantonal government has to get its business through, eye to eye with the citizens. All adults fulfill their civic duty, taking part in the central place, the Landsgemeindeplatz, to appoint the supreme authorities and to decide on important matters of the canton. The sovereign is the people in the truest sense of the word. The Latin word superanus, superior, is at the origin. The people hold the ultimate power, and governor is the folk. Coming back to our COVID topic, I need to mention that the structural principle of recursion can have more than one dimensions. For example, the primary units of a canton are not necessarily only municipalities. In our case, there are also certain hospitals which are at the same recursive levels as the municipality. And now let's get into the diagnosis. The question is, what works and what doesn't? In this diagram of the VSM, one detail deviates slightly from the usual representation. Systems 3 and 4 are not superimposed, but placed next to each other horizontally. 3 reasons. First, the closeness of system 4 to the environment is emphasized. Second, the diencephalon and ganglia embody sight, hearing, taste, and smell in the human brain. Hence, system 4 is located up front where those functions appear most. Third, the position at par with system 3 precludes impressions of superiority in terms of prestige only. Now, let's look into the diagnosis. Here we have a condensed version of the diagnosis at the national level. In brief, this is a picture of the structures as they are, the elements in red denoting missing components or dysfunctionalities. Yeah. Let's look at systems 3 and 4. S3 as powerful agents, ministers of the Bundesrat, with their resources such as the BAG, which is the Federal Office of Public Health. System 4 has a task force, essentially. A task force that writes papers for System 3. So we have a huge imbalance of varieties. There is also a lack of strategic process that involves both SR and S4. System 3 to 1, here on the vertical, there's an upward movement of multiple and diverse positions and motions of the cantons. That variety is difficult to cope with for System 3. Then we have a coordination deficit here on the right. And we have in the Systems 1, capacity and competence shortages. As far as the environment is concerned, it's very complex and difficult to keep in balance with. Let's think of all the pressure groups, the trade associations, the pharmaceutical industry, etc. A special word about the relationships between the federal and the cantonal level. As we already noted, the federal government played a highly active role based on emergency law. From there, the strongest steering activity emanated since the beginning of the pandemic. However, the Federal Council took a step back after the first wave with a downgrading from extraordinary. I talked about these two types of situation. So the extraordinary situation downgraded to special situation. Before emergency law, now abandoned the emergency law. So the Federal Council had to relinquish what was excessive power by Swiss standards. The cantons had already reclaimed their powers to manage the crisis and were now given back their primary responsibility for dealing with. There was a back and forth in that time, a back and forth of allocations and reallocations between federal government and cantons. The relationship between these authorities was thus temporarily out of balance. Also, the distribution of tasks, competences, and responsibilities was not clear in some respects. And this manifested itself in partly missing, partly contradictory regulations with the consequence of uncertainty among the people. Let's look now into more detailed facets of diagnosis versus design. First, the operative units. The cantons are extensively autonomous primary units. In general, they are very skilled in maintaining their viability. In the case of COVID, they showed some deficits of adaptation. After the Federal Council had decided to promote mass testing and vaccination, the task was to systematically implement this strategy in the cantons and municipalities. Some cantons were clearly overwhelmed with this task. They were not in a position to provide the capacities within a few weeks in accordance with the Federal Council's proposals. And when the vaccination program started, the cantons were slow in the provision of infrastructure, like vaccination centers, qualification of personnel, and so on. People need some time to be qualified. The considerable delays were the result of procurement failures in advance, System 3, and gaps in foresight, awareness, System 4. Also, the tracing method for breaking infection chains was introduced very slowly and ineffectively. So measures that have to be taken to become more open, to enhance cooperation, and to provide support from a national organ to compensate for local weaknesses. Let's go to System 1. Varying forms of enforcement of national guidelines and measures are typical of the federal systems. The meta systems of the cantons did not show a uniform level of performance. We could analyze that. But important, the cantons were often overburdened, for example, in the control of protection concepts, which were obligatory, almost obligatory, in the realization of testing and vaccination campaigns, and in the distribution of financial resources. Hence, the challenge is how can crisis management at the cantonal level gain coherence and clout? The cantons, we have some measures here. For example, organization development in these at the cantonal level would be very important for cantonal politicians, leadership education, and so on. Also, the intervention powers of federal government for the periods of extraordinary situation need some slight reinforcement. System 2. The cantons largely do not make their decisions in coordinated manner. This is an expression of federalism which is based on the principle of self-determination. When the need to coordinate it arises, this often seems out of reach. However, the Swiss Confederation has already shown that the opposite is possible. Under the pressure of survival of the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918-19, 16 cantonal councils responsible for health at that time met for an intercantonal conference, the aim of which was to solve the many major tasks in the field of sanitation and public health care, hand in hand with the public health department. This was the birth of the Health Directors Conference. I call it GDK here, and it's the Conference of the Health Directors. Today, the GDK has a coordination function insofar as it serves to form opinions between the health ministers of the cantons. Let's look at the measures. The anchoring of the coordination role in the GDK statutes would be important. Then to strengthen training and organization development with the cantonal authorities, as we just saw on the page before. And finally, the redesign, the improvement of information systems, which were really deficient, substantial improvement needed, platforms and data management in particular. Imagine, at the beginning of 2020, almost 2/3 of the practitioners sent in their data by fax. Let's go to system 3. Executive management is primarily the responsibility of the head of the Department of the Interior, that is, the Minister of Health, supported by the FOPH, the Federal Office of Public Health. He was a key figure during the phase of the extraordinary situation and also during the second shutdown. He decisively shaped the crisis management during the 3 months in which the leadership lay with the Federal Council, the Bundesrat, by means of emergency law. Decisions were taken on rules of conduct for individuals, measures concerning the activities of companies and institutions, the opening and closing of borders, and so on. In principle, all major decisions are taken by the integral Federal Council. Its members must be active at both S3, System 3 and System 5 levels, but they are also in demand for System 4. This is the case under aggravated conditions, since none of the members of the Federal Council can have the experience of a comparable crisis. Shortage of variety. The members of government can hardly cope with this complexity. Here is the first problem. Vertically in Channel 3.1, the power to issue orders is offset by the lack of enforcement and sanctioning power. Thus, the potential behavior repertoire of the Federal Council vis-à-vis cantonal claims and political pressure from interest groups is insufficient. The variety equation is out of balance. Let's look at the measures. The way out is to reduce the time commitment to System 3 for all members of the Federal Council. According to the epidemics law, the Confederation is entitled to creating a national operational body of a type of a general staff to manage enforcement in a special situation. However, such a body was never activated, and that took its revenge in fall. In other words, such an enforcement body would enable a more effective realization of the strategy. In addition, the Federal Council would have been relieved by the dedication of such a unit in System 3, and thus would have been free for stronger and necessary commitment in System 4. Auditing, on-site visits by federal magistrates and people from the FOPH complement the ongoing management information. The interaction between the FOPH with the cantonal with the Minister of Health and the cantonal physicians, valuable information about the situation in the cantons can be obtained here formally and informally, particularly. In this way, also suggestions for improving crisis management can be conveyed from the periphery to the center. Measures. First, better use of data, collection of inputs for improvement of COVID crisis management, adaptation of information systems. You see, it's coming back to information systems all the time. Installation of an early warning system and an algorithmic channel. Let's go to System 4. The government created that scientific task force in March already 2020. Now that organ was too clumsy with its 70 members. It is unclear if long-term trend, I mean, it was too clumsy, but it's also unclear, for example, if long-term trends are captured properly, and the influence on System 3 is very small. The long-term perspective tends to be neglected. I will quote the former head of the FOPH, the Federal Office of Public Health. He confessed a few days ago, we were so absorbed by the day-to-day business that the strategic part was neglected, quote end. So we have core problem 2 here. System 4 is for the time being primarily embodied in the scientific task force, and this is purely an advisory body and therefore has no authority to make strategic decisions. The interaction, System 3, System 4, shows a hypertrophy of the operative. There's a glaring lack of variety in System 4 in the sense of too little power, and an excess of variety in System 3, as a result of which System 5 also collapses into System 3. Measures. Enhance the variety of System 4, essential. Establish a strategic process as a discourse between S3 and S4. Involve ministers more tightly in strategy making, and not only in the operational dimension. Cultivate the view of the long term. So it's also a matter of cultivation, not only of formal assignment. And finally, the task force should not only be assigned for a, I don't know, limited period, it should be for a continual approach to dealing with System 4 issues. And last not least, the System 5, the identity of Switzerland is expressed in its history as a confederation. the federalist and democratic form of government. These parameters shape culture in all its manifestations. The behavior of the population, groups and individuals is largely a function of this identity. The democratic principles and values unfold great power. The country's COVID management, especially the Federal Council, has consistently relied on the principles of freedom, responsibility, a sense of common good, and trust in institutions. The normative basis for the decision makers at this top level were thus clearly defined, but there was a lack of clarity about the responsibilities in systems 4 and 3. Measures. Leave the makeup, the legal makeup as it is. No change necessary. Clarify the tasks and competencies of agents in the battle against the pandemic. The federal, the cantonal councils, the crisis staff, and so on. Strengthen the enforcement and sanctioning power of federal council in the case of crisis, question mark. And a normative discourse about values beforehand. That means we cannot discuss values and things like that while the crisis is already here. We have to do that in a long-term approach, and it should be done before the crisis comes. I have a little special chapter about information and communication systems. The deficits are obvious and astonishing. Just take the first point, mostly outdated, some even non-existent info systems, and so on. A fundamental redesign is necessary and has to be accomplished before the next crisis. So the fundamental redesign, imagine, central platform, COVID app. A COVID app, we had a COVID app and we have it and it works, and Canton Bern hired 200 people just to deal with that. St. Gallen, 100 people to deal with that. But still, people see too much as a control device. So we need a COVID app that is seen as a help, that acts quickly and reliably, and that warns and protects. We also need an easier to use registration platform for people wanting to be vaccinated. It's better in Brazil than ours, if I heard right. Avoid flops such as the vaccination platform. There was one, yes, that came out a few months ago, and it had dramatic security flaws. It was taken offline immediately. And ProMemoria, the electronic patient record data management, all of this is forthcoming and in very good quality, but there have been deficits. So let's come to the synthesis. Here we have the desired organization integrating diagnosis and design. It is visible here that the VSM is the ideal model for overcoming the deficits we identified. You turn them visible, well, it's a wonderful support for diagnosis and design. So it is visible that the VSM is the ideal mode for overcoming the deficits we identified. Finally, a reflection. How has Switzerland weathered this crisis? A key issue is the interaction of the steering functions at each of the various levels of recursion. The question is whether the principle of federalism is applicable in its entirety or must be curtailed. In a federation, the members, here the cantons, and the next level, the municipalities, have strong independent competencies. I quote the federal constitution. I translated this: the confederation shall assume only those tasks which exceed the power of the cantons or which require uniform regulation by the confederation. According to this principle, a body at the upper political level may not take over a task if it can be accomplished at the next lower layer. Conversely, if a task excessively strains the strength of the cantons, they should be supported in their fulfillment by the higher level, that is, by the federal government. And the same also between municipality and canton. In the relationship between the Confederation and the cantons, responsibilities were shifted back and forth by the parties involved at certain stages. This has not only to do with indecision, but also with an unwillingness or inability to take responsibility. Can cybernetics help here? The VSM implies the functions of the steering systems, especially the meta systems 3, 4, 5, have to be clarified. They must not remain undefined. Overall, the federalist system bears some features, limitations that lead to delays and lazy compromises. Wouldn't that be a big disadvantage? If we look at the scores of the European countries, we note the following. Here we have the deaths per 100,000 inhabitants cumulated per country. Switzerland is right in the middle of the ranking and almost equal, practically equal to the European average. Is this remarkable? No, that average is not remarkable. But wait a minute. The Oxford Stringency Index showed that the crisis comes from the University of Oxford, that the crisis management in Switzerland has been softer than in all neighboring countries. No curfews, no loitering restrictions, low travel drawbacks. The authorities hardly issued any commands whatsoever. They always appealed to the self-responsibility of each individual towards society. This is in line with the Swiss mentality. Now, how was it possible, such a soft approach to handling the crisis? The behavior of the citizens was crucial. They finally showed insight, complied with the recommendations of the authorities and adapted their behavior. Not that there would have been no resistance in Switzerland. Criticism from interest groups, for example, very heavily from the gastronomy and from certain political parties, was massive. Resistance to public measures was often exaggerated. There were also anti-corona demonstrations, but in the end, insights into the pitfalls of the virus won out. What is the role of the complicated, complex, cumbersome, slow political processes? They seem to be a disadvantage. However, it turns out that they are very strong in handling complexity. The diversity here is much greater, but the connecting elements are still stronger than the dividing elements. Just note, the citizens here have to vote 3 to 4 times a year on federal, cantonal, and local issues. That shapes culture. In the end, the complex system here warrants requisite variety. It also delivers better results because decisions are more broadly based. To quote the Minister of Justice a few days ago, she said, "One must admit that it is difficult to forge alliances across language and party boundaries. But once something has been decided, it holds. With majority governments, such as in Germany or France, more mistakes happen there because laws are rushed through, and when the government changes, everything is changed again. Our system is a bit slow, but it saves us from making bigger mistakes." End quote. You might think that it's more complicated, excuse me. You might think that it's more complicated, more expensive, more long-winded, and more inefficient. She, the minister, interjects. On the contrary, a result that is solidly supported is more efficient. This stability may be boring, but it has something good. I would add, this system is resilient. To come to the end, future crisis management in Switzerland will be challenged to probe or even redefine the line between coercion and self-responsibility. In any case, new ways must be found to sensitize the sovereign to the values of democratic society. One should not want to force anyone to be happy, but it is necessary to keep the sensitivity of the entire population high for the democratic legacy it has been given. This is not only about structure, but about the identity of a society that masters crisis. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Markus. This is an amazingly interesting presentation and study. So I think that it would be nice if we just engage in a conversation with you. I would like to do the first question. I'm very, very interested about the, let's say, well, first of all, what incidence is it going to have your study? Are you going to be discussing this with the government, or is this an academic study?
We were not put in charge by a government. I want to see you.
You can stop sharing.
Stop sharing.
Yeah.
Stop sharing. Stop. Oh yeah. It's all under my camera. So what else do I have to get?
Angela, you are the host. You can also do that from your computer.
Okay, let me see if I can. Okay.
If you are the host.
Let's see if I can. Well, I cannot find a way to do it from my computer.
Share screen, a green sign down, and then.
Oh, I see Angela now. Very good. Yes, Angela, your question was, what was our relationship with the politicians? Yes. And this was not a
commission.
This was not commissioned by a political instance. It was our idea. Right. Actually, it was. I thought when the crisis came up, yeah. I said we must do something. And what we did first, in the first month or two, we did system dynamics models. And we got very good system dynamics models with predicting very well. And then something went haywire, and we couldn't. The thing was, first we had excellent fit between simulated and actual results. And then there was a point where the thing really went chaotic, and all the specialists, one in London and Ferguson, I think is his name, and many others, they failed with their predictions. And actually, all those who are still making these models are not doing too well. So, but anyway, for me, it became very fast. I said, look, we have to look. How do people handle the COVID crisis? And the VSM is clearly the best model to deal with it. And it's interesting, as we went interviewing people, they already became interested. For example, the one person interviewed was a president of the government in St. Gallen, of the canton. And he immediately, and he's also the health minister. It's a comedy, and there are, I don't know, there are 7, I think, as well. He's one of them. He's the health minister and also a medical doctor. And so at present, he's the president of the cantonal council. And he immediately switched the gear and became aware. And he said, well, we are going to use this because in autumn, we are going to have a review, formal review of all we did and what we came to do. So there's interest. Also, it's interesting. I had this report and I said, well, actually one should publish it and so on, you know, but it's pretty long. It's not good for a journal. And so I thought it would be good in a compendium, in a book with diverse contributions. And so I asked a man who is better for that than I, because he's a professor for health and so on here at our university. I asked him if he knew something, if he knew someone who was preparing a book of that kind. And he said, no, I don't know anyone, but why don't we do one ourselves? So I think when this book comes out, this will also diffuse a little more the knowledge.
Well, no, I just asked the question because I think that we all are living similar situations, and all of us in our community who have the expertise, I think that we are very excited about the possibility of contributing precisely to the assessment, no? Because there are so many lessons and so important, and you have done an amazingly precise and very interesting work, not only in terms of the way the organizations, the health organizations and the health policies are done, but also in the relationship between the governance structure of the country and the way that this governance structure is affecting or not the pandemic. So I think that there is a really exciting field of research to continue the research in the work that you are doing. Really, really exciting. And
thank you, Angela. This is encouraging.
Excellent, really. But I will invite other people to contribute questions. Raúl, you have to unmute. Yep.
Right. Thank you, Markus. As you can imagine, I have many questions, but I'm not going to bore you with many questions, only one. And that is, what is at the moment bothering me a little bit is the difference between autonomy and independence.
Mm-hmm.
So while you describe very well levels of recursion and autonomic levels, so autonomy, cantons belonging to the federation, communities to the cantons, families to the cantons, and so on. That seems fine. But if I go to the idea of independence, is Switzerland totally independent of the European Union?
So you are going one recursion higher now.
Well, but it's not as clear as you would. I would like
sure.
to.
No, I just stated. I mean, you are going one recursion higher, and it is not independent. It is autonomous.
So, give me examples, instances that make Switzerland autonomous within the European Union. Are you members of the European Union? We are not.
Who is not?
The UK.
The UK is not independent. No, they are not independent. Sure. Look, for example, let's take the. I mean, it's a big discussion. Do we take over the law from the EU or not? To which extent do we do it? We are very much focused on one thing, on having our own judiciary or jurisdiction. So, but on the other hand, to show that there is an autonomy but not an independence, is that we pay every year what they call the cohesion billion. It's 1.4 billion, which we pay to the EU, even if we are not a member.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah, so
But we are interested in maintaining our autonomy and not taking over everything, because we see that many decisions are taken by the EU, which are very counterproductive on the bottom. But let me just give you an example.
The point is, in your study, and well, I know that your study was of your own initiative and so on. In your study, did you discuss or did you work out the values that were driving the European Union as opposed to the values that were driving the Federation and the values of the cantons? Did you, more than the structural aspect, can you discuss a little bit how is it that Switzerland is different at the different levels, is different to the European Union, and therefore that we can learn something about values and the ways they are distributed?
Well, I'm not a politician, but let me take one thing. All the authorities here in Switzerland are elected. In Brussels, you have an authority, a top authority, and it's not elected. I think this is enough as a sweeping argument, but I would many more.
Okay, may I continue with my question from the chat?
Yes, please, please.
Okay, I've already announced here that I'm doing research on complexity and ignorance. That's very fascinating for me, and you've presented, Markus, a very nice institutional diagnosis and description, so that's fine. But going one level down, this problem of the quality of the data, I think when I compare the situation, not only in Poland, but also I'm reading quite a lot about COVID, because it's a beautiful example of the social ignorance, by the way, because there are so many things changing concerning vaccines and so on. My comment to your presentation is that maybe Switzerland succeeded because of two reasons. Because of the quality of data resulting from culture and from the political system or social system that, that you have described. So the main source of success of the system that you've described is just a kind of accuracy of the data. Accuracy that the system could operate with very high reliability because of this factor. Because even if we look at the United States, that one state says no measures, no countermeasures, and Switzerland succeeded this as according to the old tradition of those precious Swiss watches. What do you think about this? That the system could filter out the lack of correction and reduce the level of uncertainty concerning the information and ignorance in a way. Thank you.
Thank you. This is very interesting, the way you look at it. And I have two comments only. The first is, well, perhaps the system is better, the data are better than we think. We are very critical. And I, as an observer and as a reporter or analyst, I had to be very critical. But one must also not forget, and that's my second point, that this political system I illustrated is a huge machinery of digesting data. And what comes out in a very qualitative mode is based on a good artificial intelligence or natural intelligence collective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Czeslaw. Anyone would like to ask a question? Yes, Elena. And then Pam, yes.
Well, first, thank you, Markus. Very enjoyable, and I'm looking forward to going over it in more detail. My question is, Switzerland seems to have buffers against noise in the system and against misinformation and politicization of the data. Is that the case? And how is that accomplished?
Well, there's a lot of noise in such a system, but there are some devices that help to switch or to filter out noise. And we know from the pragmatic behavioral, from the pragmatic derivatives of behavioral science, we know that having a little team around one table helps as a mechanism of weeding out errors. Could I say it like that? So it's the error elimination mechanism. And I think as we go, we have a lot of these error elimination mechanisms, which I would call as noise killing filters. And some of them are by design, or it's basically it's mostly by design. Some were lucky events that led to these structures and so on. But it was always some shrewd people who came up with this. And if they didn't come up, the people would knock them down, you know. This was this dialogue between the people and the authorities.
Okay, thank you, Elena. Pam.
So my question is kind of more from a selfish perspective from the research I'm doing, but in the recursive level of the cantons or even below, what I find is there's fairly good communicate, could be improved with information systems between the operations going up and down. But in the systems 4, sometimes the recursive elements below have better system 4 than, let's say, the Federation does. And so one of the things that I've run into is how do you coordinate the anticipatory functions within like the system 1s to bring them up directly to system 4 so that it can be kind of not just a system 4 function, but it's a collaborative, accumulation of system 4 functions from the system 1 so that the system 4 within the Federation can be stronger because of that. So how do we improve that line that goes from the system 1s to system 4 and not always just kind of like through 3?
Well, if you wouldn't have said it, I would have said it. The systems 4 at the lower levels of recursion are stronger than those at the federal level. It is so. And just take the mayor of St. Gallen. He's 80,000 inhabitants. The mayor is a very, very clever person and very circumspect and accurate, integer, and he understood himself as the manager of the COVID crisis. He took it in hand. And I must say that he involved the whole city council in this, and they were essentially the same people were with the 3 head and the 4 head. But into 4, they called also other people. And these people were sometimes also from lower levels. So they were fed with very good inputs. And I think that's the way to go because, you know, the Conan-Ashby theorem, every good regulator must be every good regulator must be a model of the system. So if the system 4 has an insufficient model, it will fail. And to have that good model, it needs more resources than system 3 to make its operative model. And that's why Stafford created its integration, for example. How do we involve 30 people or a lot of people into that process of dealing with the future?
Right.
John Lee has a question. Go on.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for your talk, Marcus. I was born in Munich. So to me, Switzerland is right here. It's somewhere behind my back. but to me, I'm in California. To me, Switzerland is more free than California because the cantons have so much more power than the federal government. It is the most decentralized country in the world, I think. And so it's isolated in the middle of Europe, much as Taiwan is at the edge of China. And it's as free from Europe as the rest of the countries are from China. So from my standpoint, subsidiarity is a very powerful idea that you got from the Catholic Church. The idea is the Pope doesn't know everything, and the priest knows a lot more than the Pope does about what's going on in the parish. And I think that's how canton government works. It's much more efficient than the way we do it in America. So I loved your presentation, and it was a great analysis. I know a lot about the healthcare system. I read your paper in Christopher's book. So I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. Thank you very much. And I love Switzerland, and I wish we could all be like Switzerland.
Well, it's a pleasure to hear from a man of California, to see a different view. And I'm glad that you tell us that we are on a good way, but we have to improve. We have to improve. On the other hand, and we also have to put a lot of brain power and effort into maintaining or developing into the future this system, this political system. Thank you, John Lee.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to ask a question? I have another question while everybody thinks about it. This is a theoretical question. Yeah, I'm still struggling to understand in a situation like this, like the COVID. Yeah, you have always a dilemma. The national government, when they decide policies, the COVID policies, most of the national governments tend to think that the best strategy will be to decide at the national level all most of the guidelines, and in some cases, like in the UK, to manage the PPE and all the resources, to make sure with the idea that by making sure that they control the resources, then they will make sure that the resources will be fairly distributed to those places where there is more need for them. But this is clearly a very centralized way of thinking, yeah, and that can end up in producing chaos. Here in the UK, for instance, they started thinking that way, and shortly later they recognized that that was not working, because the centralized PPE management was leaving everybody in need, and that was really creating chaos and resulted in losses of life, and they changed the strategy. Yeah, but what do you think that from a BSM perspective, when we are talking about crisis management, a situation like this, in which we need to have some kind of cohesion, we need to have some kind of general guidances, and system 3 and system 2 very clear. But what do you think in terms of to what extent we should or not limit the power of the central government to make decisions like this kind of decisions, very operational decisions? What is your thinking about that?
I'm convinced that we have to limit that power. And even if the law, like the law I mentioned, the emergency law, gives the government the power to do some things which are not yet in the law. Sometimes also Switzerland does it like this. If it works, they make a law of it afterwards, but they're always hesitant to make a lot of laws. So I applaud limiting that. And you must think, if you say, but how do you do it? There's an emergency law, they can do what they want. No, they cannot do what they want. There's an argument from above and from below. From above, Parliament can stop them anytime. There was a curious story here that the Parliament was going to meet, and that was the day with the with the largest COVID numbers, you know, and they had to close the parliament for infection danger. So, but anyway, then they got together, but they can stop them. And from below, the approach is the following: always the government listens to some bodies from below, which have a 1, 3, and a 2 function, and this is a GDK, the committee of the health directors of the cantons. You know, they have to be heard normally in the special situation and so on, but they are also heard in the emergency situation. They are more by practice. I think by law, they could also be not heard. I'm not quite sure, but anyway, the practice dictates that this is a natural phenomenon. The place is also so small, you know, they run into each other all the time anyway. So Leopold Kohr, who is the teacher, the professor of Schumacher, small is beautiful, he would enjoy him. For him, Switzerland was always a good example. You can pick up the phone and call the president.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much. Any other comments, questions? Well, if there is not more questions, then we should say again, thank you very much, Markus. This is really exciting. And please, if you decide to publish, let us know, because it will be very interesting for people to, for us in particular, to read more in detail this study. It's really, thank you.
Okay, pleasure.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to talk to you and Nana, to have such a auditorium.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Markus.
Thank you. See you in 2 weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now. Bye now.